man knows. I mean, there's a kind of spilling over of not boring erudition, but just real enthusiasm and knowledge, which is completely irresistible. But the subtitle of this book is also a kind of joke. For those of you who aren't familiar with it already, the book tells the story of the cult of Salar Masood, Urf Ghazi Mian, the nephew or bhanja of the great despoiler and invader Sultan Mahmud of Ghazni. Except, of course, the Sultan Mahmud had no such bhanja, had no such nephew. Ghazi Mian finds no mention in the historical chronicle either at the time of Sultan Mahmud or, as Shahid tells us, for 300 years afterwards. So this is an account of the afterlife of a man who never lived. Shahid, how did an idea as eccentric as this first occur to you?
Well, you didn't read the subtitle of my first book.
Which book? The title of your first book was like the subtitle of most others.
Which, following kind of in an Adam Smithian vein, was called An Inquiry into Peasant Production for Capitalist Enterprise in Colonial India. You know, sorry. And I remember that when I was putting the title to my Chori Chora book, you reminded me. I did not know that you will remind me again this time. It was called, that was called Chori Chora 1922 event met for memory. You said, no, you do. But I didn't consult you for this one. Yes, no, that was the crucial issue was that if you grew up in Eastern UP, Ghazi Mian or Bale Mian was a proverbial presence. You know, you didn't have to really locate him in a point of time. People knew about Ghazi Mian and his life, not necessarily in an abbreviated way, but the name had resonances all over. I try to, point that out. There are any number of proverbs about him. In fact, Ravi Kant dug out this great gem in a movie called Machli Didi. Meena Kumari's daughter is engaged in a riddle competition with her mother, and she says, "Itne lambe Ghazi Mian, utni lambi poonch, aage chalte Ghazi Mian, phasti jaye poonch." Right? So Ghazi Mian or Bale Mian is everywhere, and the shrine and the cult was very important. And I started from there. The fact that we know a definite date for his death was good enough for me. Whether he was born, when he was born, was there in the hagiography. But it's really the afterlife of a figure who is placed in a very contentious time. And that placement is not such a disruption as to convert him into a totally pacifist person. So how does a character who is able to displace Mahmud of Ghazni without being a pacifist, how does this person or the idea survive? That was my interest, and hence the afterlife.
So when you began writing this book or researching this book, you knew that he was not a real person. I mean, this is something you knew before you began your research, or something? I mean, did you set out to do? I'm just amused by the possibility that you set out to do your research to try and actually, ground him in the real texture of the historical chronicle. You knew that he didn't exist. That you knew that he
didn't exist.
You knew this when you began.
Yes.
Okay.
He still does.
It's not something you discovered.
After 25.
One of the things that this book foregrounds, both in a wonderful opening chapter and then two great resonant chapters at the end, is that it explicitly puts this book right in the middle of an argument about our past, and an argument that all of us are familiar with, an argument about a composite past, a composite culture that defines a particular vision of the past. And in fact, I think the central reason for writing this book and this becomes obvious when, as you read through it, is that what Shahid is doing is that he's taking exception to the idea that you can conjure up a composite past in defense of a pluralist present without doing the hard work of dealing with the bad things that happened in especially the medieval past. So he has a great sentence where he says, he's just spoken of the great Sufi shrines at Ajmer and Nizamuddin. And he says, I don't want to deny the fact that these shrines represent compositeness and represent a kind of intercommunity following. What he says is, quote, all I wish to do is to create a space for clash and conquest as necessary elements of the prehistory of cultic sites, such as Ajmer and Nizamuddin. So what he's actually saying is that we can't leave the invasion and the conflict. We can't actually use as our staple the peace and the harmony and leave to sectarian ideologues and historians the invasions and the conflicts. And in a sense, what you're arguing right through this book is that the cult and the legend of Ghazi Mia and the way in which you trace your way through this helps us do this. How? I mean, what is it about the story of Salar Masood that is, if not exemplary, at least representative of this kind of path or this kind of alternative?
You know, this, as I said in my comments, this quest really goes back to the 1980s, where a large section of the Indian population are supposed to be ipso facto inheritors of a past consisting of mutilated memories, and that this is the basic template, and it must and should surface sooner or later, and that's where we are in a sense today. And I wanted to write non-sectarian histories of sectarian conflict, because there was this very easy division where the in fact, medievalists didn't write about him because it's only in India that medievalists find it difficult to write about non-existent persons. Meaning, in Europe, medievalists do that all the time. You know, so I was trying to argue that there is obviously, so it's not a case of people, you know, you bring your holy book, we bring our holy book, and we work together to a syncretic thing. If you look at the hagiographies of very prominent Sufi saints, there is also a spiritual contest, meaning where the yogi is worsted, which is an analog of the thrust of swords and sabers and so on. So I thought that this, and people have written about warrior saints, how they follow in the wake of the invasion of Deccan by Alauddin Khilji and so on. I wanted to talk about this person, whom I also knew from, you know, popular lore, as the best example, because, you know, he is made to inhabit the 11th century of Mahmud of Ghazni, and his life partakes of that. So there's no denying that. But on the other hand, that most public of events, invasion, is domesticated in terms of his relationship to familial anxieties, not simply in terms of boon giver for children, but the relationship between a bahu in a distant sasural and the brother who comes to see. So that, you know, I was trying to argue that there is something in a way in which I cannot really prove why exactly Hindus go and worship. This is a demand I can't, you know, fulfill as a historian. I can show the reasons and the ways in which, when asked in 1891 in Bengal, in Banaras and Gorakhpur, what is your religion? People say, hum Pachpidiya hai. They don't say, hum Hindu hai. Huh? So there is a way in which the layered relationship to holy figures with definite aggressive and conflictual past is such that, you know, the medieval actions of conquest are not the overriding consideration in working out attitudes of deference and gratitude and living with regard to saintly presence. So a saintly presence need not really be a saintly presence in that sense.
Yeah. I just actually listening to you. There's a great paragraph where Shahid puts this as sharply and pointedly as it's possible to put it about how about why we have to look the fact of, if you will, conquest, which is one of the terms of the title, why we have to look at the fact of conquest in the eye. I just want to read a couple of sentences. Early on in the introduction, Shahid says, medieval Muslim warfare and rule, circa 1000 AD onwards, has understandably been the object of considerable narrative anxiety from the 19th century to the present. Then he goes on to say, for a large part, mainstream history writing usually relates to one form of community, the national community. Modern history, and I think this is a really important insight, modern history invokes the idea of a people as sovereign and historically constituted. And this has been productive of most national histories. The triumph of the idea of self-determination has meant that all conquest has come to be regarded as unjust. How can the historian's history then engage in newer ways with the issue of conquest? In this case, the Turkish conquest of North India from 1000 AD to 1200. So I think one of the things that the opening of this book does is it makes completely explicit what, if you will, the intellectual stakes are. That this is not a fiercely local account, not that one need be embarrassed about its localness, that this is not merely a local account of a particular kind of cult in Eastern UP, that this is, if you will, exemplary of what we should be trying to do. Now, one of the things that the reader quickly gets used to is the fact that your book tells and retells constantly the story of Ghazi Mia. I mean, and it tells and retells it through many kinds of sources, many of which are narratives. So you have competing and overlapping narratives that tell you in many different ways, in many different idioms and accents, with varying degrees of sharpness, the story of Ghazi Mia. There's a 17th century account in Persian, which in a sense is the spine of the story. There's a later Urdu reworking of this Persian text, which is completely different in tone. And then Shahid points us to modern, sharply polemical tellings of the story from both sides, from sectarian Hindus and sectarian Muslims in Urdu and in Hindi. But most interestingly of all of these are counterpointed by the tellings of this, not in formal written narratives, but in bardic performance and in folklore. I was, one of the things that occurred to me while reading this, and here the question is really to the craft of a historian, is this book a kind of historical experiment where instead of explaining why something happened, such as you just mentioned this, such as why Hindu pastoralists should revere an iconoclastic kafir conquering saint, you set out to explain how it happened, how the legend of the never-born Ghazi was transmitted and received. And you did it by looking at the connections between written, spoken, and sung narratives. So my question is that, is this a history of transmission and reception, like, in a sense, not that far away from your earlier history of the Mahatma and the way in which he was received? That historically, are you, in a sense, talking about how the message goes out and how it is received, instead of asking the question why someone did or why people did what they did?
Yeah, I hadn't thought of it that way, but let me try and respond. We have to also, in engaging with this figure and his cult, I guess we have to distance ourselves with what we regard would be an adequate explanation, which would satisfy us. And when you say an adequate explanation, you've already closed the door on any explanation, because the adequate explanation in this would mean crossing boundaries which cannot be crossed. Why should Hindus who are different from Muslims have any truck with not a guy who's not only a Muslim but the nephew of Mahmud? If you put it like that, you know, there's no way in which you can answer that. And yet, I don't have to really argue it as a position to begin with. This is what the historical documentation shows us. Now, if that is the case, and it also allows us to really make a breach in the easy, polarity between, Turkiana and Sufiana, I thought this is where one should, make a breach. So you try and do a book on a person who is most problematic for medieval historians, for everybody. And you are trying to then say that, well, if you are willing to listen to my story of Ghazi Mia, then you have to rearrange your intellectual furniture. And we have to then move towards understanding how the popular mind works, rather than why did this Teli, who's a Teli but also a Hindu, have anything to do with this guy who is not only a Muslim, but as all Telis must know of all sorts, that he is actually the nephew of, Mahmud of Ghazni, whom everybody knows who Mahmud of Ghazni is. So, there is a way in which I am saying, giving a certain, a great deal of space to the workings of the popular mind and trying to then show you how that works in terms of historical material, in terms of folklore, in terms of bringing a collage between the two, because otherwise it is inexplicable. It should not happen. Ghazi Mia should not have happened. He didn't happen actually in that sense. But if he has happened, then you can't really work out a rationalist, modern, nationalist explanation for this, and I don't see why. Because if I go along, then I cannot tell the story. So really, I'm asking the reader for the permission to narrate. Allow me to tell you how this happens, so that allows us to broach the larger question of the relationship between conquest and memory, which is because we don't have any kind of photocopied access to the ways in which Hindu mind has felt it then and now and so on and so forth. We must really look at the workings of the Gangetic popular, as I call it, and then try and use it to argue a larger position that if within the present nation state, difference is recognized now, gender, community, and so on, how are we going to relate to the conflicts of the past as also belonging to the history of the nation, rather than belonging to sectarian, or interested secular, projections which have no basis anywhere.
Right.
Since the majoritarian view is based on belief, I am trying to now take belief very seriously and see where it takes us.
You spoke of Turkiana and Sufiana in the course of this of this response, and in the course of your book you mention the Sufis of Bijapur by Eaton, which is a wonderful book that both of us admire. And Eaton tells the story of how the ideas of Islam penetrate the sort of Dakhini countryside, principally through women, through Sufi shrines and pirs, and not via, shall we say, mosques and ulama. Now, from the point of view of your book, what is your view of what Eaton manages? Does Eaton, I'm asking this question because I'm trying to work out where you situate yourself vis-a-vis someone like Eaton, who's worked specifically on this idea of how, again, ideas are transmitted and ideas are received. Does, for example, I just offer this as a provocative question, does Eaton ignore the religious self-assertion and conflict inherent in the establishment of any Sufi silsila on the non-Muslim frontier, as Bijapur would have been then? Or is there a kind of similarity with your project in the way in which, for example, these Sufi shrines appeal to female worshippers looking for health and fertility? And one of the abiding themes in this book is precisely